All right. Good evening. It is so
Hello.
wonderful to have Dr. Wendi Johnson with us tonight
Thank
for
you for having
our,
me.
yes, absolutely. I have to start out and say that Wendy and I met in the most unique way. And so tell a little backstory, and then I'm going to let her dive a little deeper into who she is and a little bit more about her and her background. But Wendy reached out after receiving the PDSES, which is the Parent Directed Special Education Services grant that used to be referred to as the SSES, through TEA, and contacted me as a coach for executive function for her son. And so we started talking and started planning some sessions. And that was how we initially got to know each other. And it has been an absolute joy to learn more about her, her family, and her background, and the journey that she has had walking through paths that are very familiar to a lot of parents. And I'm going to throw it
Mhm,
back to Wendy and let her jump in and just share a little background about herself professionally and
mhm.
about her family. So, Wendy, just jump
Sure.
in.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that intro. Yeah, we met, I guess it was not quite a year ago, but almost in regards to executive function coaching for my son, Levi. He's in sixth grade. And so that is one of my main jobs as mom to four kids. Three of the four have ADHD. So we have a lot of EF issues, a lot of executive function issues. So it was nice to have somebody to connect with on that who understood it from a conceptual level and also just as a mom, too. But then professionally, I think I wear a different hat, but also a lot of overlapping as far as being mom in the home setting, but also professionally. I'm a professor of 14 years at Texas Women's University in the school psychology PhD program there. And so I've been training future psychologists this past season of life. But I'm also a licensed psychologist. And so one day a week, I run an autism clinic as well. So I'm on that assessment diagnostic side. And so obviously with autism, we have a lot of executive functioning deficits as well associated with an autism spectrum disorder. And so I've done a lot of work in EF. Actually, my dissertation many years ago was in executive functioning. So it's interesting to me professionally how I kind of started my career in executive functioning, wrote a couple book chapters and different things in regards to that. And then kind of my parenting journey took over as I was still teaching stuff. I'm doing a lot of research in video self modeling and autism. And now I'm kind of coming back around to executive functioning again because I'm living it. And two of my four kids are adopted. So we have a lot of adoption trauma as well, which also has a lot of executive functioning deficits, plus the ADHD. Plus, we had my mom with Alzheimer's living with me for 3 years. And so we had a lot of executive functioning deficits on the other end of the developmental spectrum. So I've seen both the early childhood, middle childhood, as well as the geriatric end of executive functioning deficits. And so a lot of EF in this last, I'll say, 5 years of my life on the home front. And so it's interesting how my professional life has now come back around and I'm living it out every day. So I think opportunities like this to talk about it, I think it's interesting and fun both professionally and personally because I feel like I've lived it, but I also know it from a academic standpoint as well. And so I think it's good to blend both of those together.
That is incredible. I have enjoyed just learning every bit of the background where Wendy comes. It's such a familiar background in that she's walking this journey. But what is so intriguing is she has so much in-depth training and so much expertise, published author and speaker. And I know she probably didn't even hit the tip of the iceberg with a lot of what she has done in the past. And one thing that has always piqued my curiosity with you, Wendy, is if you think about that training and the space that you're in on the day in and day out, how has that training and your career in psychology truly influenced how you approach advocacy for your own
Mhm.
children in the ARD process? Because I do want to focus and highlight the ARD process tonight.
Sure.
But you have two hats. You have that mom mindset, but then you know all these things. And
Mhm.
then, some parents know some things, some parents know a lot of things. Everybody comes in at a different place.
Sure.
Is that a challenge? Is it helpful? Where are you at with all of that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I was trained as a school psychologist first. And so I have that educational special ed background, worked in the schools for 6 years in New Orleans, which that's an interesting, different dynamic in North Carolina, and then as well as here in the Texas area. And so got some good experience there in different states. Every state is different in regards to school psychology services. And obviously we have federal law with IDA, but then we have the state's implementation of the state regulations. And so it really is different to see different districts and how they implement school psychological services. But the benefit of that is being able to understand federal law and what does IDEA tell us
Mhm.
across those different school districts in different states. And so having that knowledge prior to becoming a parent, I didn't get married till I was 30. I didn't have my kids till I was 34, 35. And then we adopted the twins when I was 40. So, I think
Mhm.
I'm an older mom, but I had a lot of that good training and experience in the school setting as well as in private practice. But how has that shaped? I think, I think back to prior working in schools, working with parents before I had kids. And, you can know things academically. And I would say stuff like when parents would ask me different questions about kids or home or behavior, different things. I say, well, the research says, right?
Mhm.
Because that's what I would know, right? I knew what the research says. What are the recommendations? What should we do? But I do feel like after that shift of becoming a parent and then parenting kids with some neurodiversity, you just know it. You can answer those questions differently, right? I can still say what the research
Mhm.
says, but I can also say, well, this is something I've tried, with my kid with ADHD or whatever. And,
Mhm.
I think that helps to have that personal connection with parents. And I think that's where that shift really happened for me professionally, not having that knowledge cognitively, but then switching over to that uh, personal knowledge as a parent and being able to really have more empathy because I'm living it as
Mhm.
well, versus just knowing it from a cognitive perspective. So I think that really helps. And then specific to the art process,
Mhm.
it's a hard thing to go from sitting on one side of the table as the school psychologist to sitting on the other side of the table as the parent, right? Those who have sat on both sides, it is an interesting dynamic because on the professional side, you're talking about your report and your testing and what you did and your recommendations, but then you're flipping, you're on the other side and you're the receiver, and it's talking about your own child. So you having to hear that, as a parent, and sometimes those things are hard to hear, right? They're really
Yeah.
struggling here. Sometimes these reports are hard to hear because often it's deficit based, and here they're missing here, or they're behind grade
Yeah.
level here, and it just kind of goes through that process. And so sometimes it's hard to hear. On that parent side of the table. So I think it has really helped me be able to share results with parents now professionally in a lot more empathic, connected way, and in a more strengths based. My current reports now at the Autism Center, I always end with strengths and protective factors, and what are all these amazing things that your child can do. And so while we are, point out areas of need and areas of support, we're also showing a lot of the really good strengths and protective factors. So specific to the art meeting though, I think um it's hard because sometimes the law and you know what the expectations are, and when the
Mhm.
school maybe doesn't follow that or doesn't have that, then it's that awkward position of you don't want to correct or be authoritative in any way, but you also know that you have to advocate for your child. And so, how do you navigate that role of still trying to maintain those relationships with the teachers and the administration, but also maybe point out things that are um, not going the best way? And so,
Mhm.
and still supporting teachers and supporting the process and being collaborative, but also advocating when you need to stand up for things that
Mhm.
aren't done well. And I think that's
Mhm.
the hard line that I still walk all the time. And that's where a lot of our
Mhm.
conversations come in because sometimes it
Right.
helps just to have another parent or another person to talk to that, hey, this is
Mhm.
what I think what they need to do for my kid. This is what they're
Mhm.
recommending. And, how do we find that collaboration between those two sides?
Right. And I think I heard you say collaboration, and that word always resonates when you're working with a school, and it is collaborative, should be a collaborative process.
Sure.
Everybody is on that team working together. And
Hmm.
so I can appreciate that as well. And so I want you to kind of put your parent hat on again
Yep.
and think a little bit about I know you know so many things coming in and how to prepare, but a lot of parents feel like they don't. And that's what
Yeah.
I hear a lot. are I'm not I come and I hear all the things like what you were
Right.
explaining, and it
Absolutely.
feels deficit based, even though sometimes maybe it's not, but it can
Right.
feel that way. And if
Absolutely.
we know that if that's the parent's perception, that's so 100% real to
Mhm.
them. But what could you offer to parents that are going into, and especially our even younger parents, and this could actually apply to parents of, along the seasons, but my heart
Sure.
is thinking about a lot of my parents are just starting out.
Right.
It's overwhelming. I've heard time and time again after the meeting, I just want to go cry. and
Right.
and maybe it wasn't
Yes.
even maybe there was really nothing
Right. Right. Nothing
really that
bad per
that
se.
triggered
Yeah.
it, but it's just so overwhelming because there's 10 people at the table and all of the things.
Yeah.
But talk about a little bit what mindset helps to go in, and then maybe a little bit too on preparation, especially
Mhm.
for parents that just don't even know where to start. They're showing up.
Yes.
What would you
Yes.
say?
No, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of things we can do, but I also wanted to start with I can empathize with that
Yeah,
framework, even with the knowledge. Like I know the law, I know the special education
yeah,
procedures and stuff. I still feel that way. So talking about, sitting at the table with 10 people looking at you and like, talking to you and telling you about your child, I still feel that way. And so that has I've said this to my students when I teach. I'm like, if I feel this way with the knowledge, what about the parents who don't have that knowledge and haven't had that experiences yet, with special ed and understand all the acronyms and just the way we say things in the schools and stuff.
yeah. So
And
you
so
share
I
that in
just
your classroom when you're
I
teaching at
I
the
do.
college. Yeah, at the
I do.
university.
Yeah.
Yeah,
At the
that's so
in my
important. I'm so
graduate
glad to
classes.
hear that.
Yeah. Training future school psychologists and future, private practice psychologists because it's just different. I mean, even with that knowledge, I still feel that I don't know if intimidation is the right, that's kind of a strong word, but just that, I don't know, a little bit of awkwardness or just like, where's my role or what do I say? Or I don't know. There's just something there. It is. It's very hard. So it has given me a better perspective of understanding how parents feel walking into this room of, 10 practitioners and educators and really needing to do that. So um all right. That you talked about, oh, the different things that we can do in preparation. So, I mean, I feel like TEA has a lot of great resources on their website. The procedural safeguards, I would definitely recommend parents reading through that. It's not very
Yeah.
interesting, but it is important to know. Um, the Parent's Guide to the ARD process, I think that is just a great starting point. I feel like they lay it out pretty well. But just know that no matter how much, like I've been doing this for 20 years in Texas, and I still am constantly learning and constantly going back to the laws and looking up things. And so it's not oh, I've got it now. Like I'm good to go. It's going to have to be a continual thing, especially for, like you said, these parents who are just starting out. Maybe their kid just turned 3 and they're just picking up school services. And so they just need to just know that it's going to continue as their child matriculates through the educational process, that they're just going to have to keep learning and keep knowing
Mhm.
because there's not an end point. I don't know if you feel that way, but I constantly feel like I'm always learning or just like I feel like something's not
Absolutely.
quite right, but I have to go back and look it up and just make sure. So
Yeah, yeah. And I'm a little bit older, I feel like, than a lot of moms that I work with, and I've been at this since 1990, and there's still so much to learn, and I definitely myself collaborate with others that have been working in this space too,
right,
and also refer and defer to the law, and the law, and some things change over time, and you have to keep up with it, and so I
for
can
sure,
appreciate that you're basically advocating that we just stay learners as parents,
for sure.
so that, we can come in and prepare. So I think that's
Yeah,
good. And
I
I think
think
it's sage advice for sure.
yeah, I
Um,
think definitely study up what you can, but I think it's
yes.
also having that collaborative mindset that we've talked about.
Hmm.
It doesn't have to be a adversarial. It shouldn't be.
Hmm.
Does it
Hmm.
sometimes go that way? It does at times, but I think if we try to have that collaborative mindset and maybe, they're recommending this and you think this and you do need to figure out some kind of compromise or come to the middle ground there. But I think having
Hmm.
that mindset of this is a collaborative process, it's not
Yeah.
us versus them.
Yeah.
Um, I think that's important too because I remember a time, this is a long time ago, I was working with a parent and they had just gotten their child was eligible and we were having the art meeting and everything. And they told me later, so this is a couple years down the road, once I'd gotten to know them a little bit better, they was like, well, when we first started, we were told we had to give an advocate and we had to fight for this. So they came in with that mindset of like, an us versus them, like it was going to be a fight or a battle. And she and I talked about it later once we, had that relationship. She was like, it doesn't have to, it's not that way. It's not that way at all. And I was like, yeah, it doesn't have to be. But they had just heard that from other parents or something, that they had to go in kind of ready for battle, and it doesn't have to be
Mhm.
that way. And so
Yes.
I think we can
Um,
create collaborative interactions between the school and the parent. It,
yeah.
it
Yeah.
doesn't have to be difficult.
I can appreciate that. And just most recently, I have a parent who was told by some other parents at a
Mhm.
specific school district that get ready, you're going to walk into
Yeah,
XYZ. And I said, you know what?
right,
That's not your story.
right,
That's their story right now. We're gonna have a different mindset coming in,
right,
and we're going to assume the positive on the front end. And so sometimes even with the parents that I know, and then the educators that you're training up, the psychologists, um, even just shaping that mindset to walk in, and try to bring that positivity and collaboration. It doesn't have to
right,
be negative. I don't like to live in that space that's heavy.
right.
And sometimes, yeah, there's hard conversations. And I know you and I've talked enough to know that,
Mhm.
we've had those, and
Yep,
sometimes I'll bounce something off Wendy and say,
sure.
what do you think about this wording? Because
Mhm.
I don't want to come across as that way. And I know, Wendy
Right,
doesn't either. And I know, just in our conversations that's takes effort. And
sure.
it takes, some thinking and commitment on the front end to look and see how you're
Mhm.
walking into that space. So I
Right,
could
right.
appreciate that. I appreciate you sharing that.
Mhm.
That kind of leads us, we're talking about educational eligibility and why we're even
Mhm.
at these meetings versus
Right.
potentially a clinical diagnosis. And you and I've talked recently, that's come up in
Yes.
a lot of
Mhm.
conversations that we've had just separately with different people. Can you
Right.
talk about that for a moment and just kind of let us know, your thinking on that?
Mhm.
Even, just at the university level as you're
Mhm.
teaching, your students, what are you telling them and how are you teaching that?
Right.
What are you telling parents?
Right. No, and this is an excellent question. Literally just last week had a parent ask me the same question. So, it I think it's really confusing because people hear, I'll just use autism. People hear, "Oh, my child got autism at school," and they think that that will then apply in a medical setting, or they'll be able to get services outside the school or whatever. And so I think that's important that people understand. We actually have like two different nomenclatures, two different diagnostic criteria is on one side. So that's the DSM, the Statistical Manual that psychologists use in order to create a diagnosis. And so that's a clinical or a medical diagnosis would be ICD-10, clinical would be DSM. And so that's on one side. And that's where you get, the autism criteria, intellectual disability, different things are on one side. But then when we transition over to school eligibility, I think that's the important thing. We have eligibility on one side and we have diagnosis on one side.
Mhm.
And while we may use some of the same words, autism being one of those, are they use the same word in both of those criteria, they're not the same. So
Mhm.
diagnosis is medical or clinical. Eligibility is this educational, it's school. And they're two different things. So even in this example with autism, the criteria are different. So in a clinical setting, you need restrictive repetitive behaviors and you need social pragmatic, language impairment evidenced across, multiple different measures and multiple different times and different raters. Whereas in the educational setting, we don't need those restrictive repetitive behaviors. We need other things with the social and the communication impact.
Yeah.
And then the biggest difference too is that we need educational impact. So you could have somebody with a high functioning autism, but if it's not impacting them educationally, they will not be found eligible. Even though they may have a clinical diagnosis of autism, they may not have an educational eligibility. And so parents, I think, have a hard time understanding that.
Yeah.
One is special education eligibility, which is under
Right.
federal law for IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and one is a DSM criteria or clinical diagnosis,
Mhm.
which can then be used for like services such as ABA or speech therapy or whatever.
Mhm.
And so I think that's really important for parents to understand that there's two different
Mhm.
uh, nomenclatures, two different ways of
Mhm.
talking about it. There is overlap, but they're not the same. And so
Right.
you can get a clinical diagnosis of autism and the school can choose to accept it. They don't have to. They can do their own testing. Oftentimes maybe they would take portions of the clinical assessment and they'll add the educational academic component, but it won't work the other way around. You can't get
Yeah.
the educational eligibility and then say that that will apply then to that clinical diagnosis. So
Right.
it only goes
Right.
one way. If you get the
Right.
clinical diagnosis, it can, doesn't have to, but it
Mhm.
can work for educational eligibility if the art committee chooses to accept that
Right.
outside
Right.
the outside diagnosis to create
Mhm.
an educational eligibility, but it will not go the other way. You cannot get a school eligibility of autism and then say it's going to apply for that clinical services.
Right. Yeah. I am so glad to hear you speak to that because I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions that a lot of parents have is that assessment, whichever one they choose to get, is so
Yeah,
portable and can cover all the bases, and it does not.
right.
And we're talking about finances, and
Oh,
we're bringing in
absolutely.
insurance. If you're talking about outside
Sure.
testing, it's not.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it costs
Wait a
a
minute,
little money.
it kills me when I would have parents bring me this report from a, outside that they paid potentially thousands of dollars for,
Yes.
and I say,
Yeah.
but they didn't have certain tests or they didn't have different educational components that we needed, so then I would have
Mhm.
to then test again the child to get that
Yeah.
educational eligibility, or they
Correct.
would get this outside assessment and then the child wouldn't be eligible to schools because it didn't have any educational need. There's no
Right.
impact
Right.
socially,
Right.
academically, so it's just hard because parents kind of think maybe, if hey, if I
Yeah.
get this, I'm going to automatically get, speech services in the schools or social skills or whatever it is. And it
Right.
just doesn't work that way. So I think it's important to set those
Yeah.
expectations at the beginning of the
Yes.
process rather than
Yes.
parents, paying thousands of dollars or thinking they're getting something when that's not going to necessarily translate.
Yes. And if in doubt, ask, reach out,
Yes.
talk to the diagnostician at your school and ask questions. Most recently in some executive function tutoring, I've heard a high school teacher and a middle school teacher say, and this can apply across the board, not just to our students in school, but the students that ask the most questions usually make the best grades. And so I have just kind of passed that on in my executive function instruction, and I have taken that to heart. And I love to ask a lot of questions, and I think that helps just to clear things up, and it can definitely, in this case, save you money, time, grief, in so many of those in that space, because you don't want to bring the wrong test to the
Right.
wrong, place, whether it be campus or clinical. You want to get that straight. And so, thank you for talking
Mhm.
about that a bit. Um, with that being said, we're talking all around and in and out about ARDS, and so when we're addressing, the most common mistakes parents could potentially make, and that being maybe one of the big ones is just not having a good understanding of what tests needs to be, facilitated where and for who and why.
Mhm. Right.
Let's kind of put that a pin in that, and let's talk about what are some other mistakes in your opinion that a parent would want to avoid and not step into, and then how can they avoid them, you know,
Mhm.
potentially making a mistake that they wish that they had known or someone had
Right.
shared with them on the front end.
Sure, sure. Yeah, that's a good question because it's hard to always anticipate, what could go wrong or what might happen in
Okay.
those meetings. We can plan and be prepared, and then it may not always go that way. But two things I think that first come to mind are maybe agreeing without fully understanding. I
Okay.
think
Good.
given what we were talking about earlier with that room full of 10 people and everyone looking at you, and you just feel like you have to agree because that's what they're
Mhm.
telling you to do. And I think that's the part is I don't want parents to feel like they have to agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's in the law. You don't have to agree. You can even, take 5 days. They don't have to implement it yet. You have lots of options. I always encourage parents to take a recess. If there's something that's bothering you, but you just in the moment can't articulate it, or I mean, sometimes I like to think about it. I have to step back, like out of that meeting. I have to go on a walk or call somebody like you and just say, hey, something's bothering me. Here's what happened.
Yeah.
Am I thinking of this the right way, or just something like that? Because
Yeah.
it's just in the moment, it is tough. It is tough. I recently had an art with my other son, and it was a scenario that came up that I was not anticipating. And so we talked through it, and I was like, "Is that really? I don't know." It was bothering me, and finally, I just said, "I think I need to take a recess." And I just asked for recess, and they said, okay, fine. And so that way, that gave me, I think we came back, like 7 days later or something. I had time to think about it. I talked through it. Read something, like I just needed to process it a little bit. And so I want parents to know that that's their right. They can take a 5-minute recess and just walk out in the hallway, get some water,
Yeah.
or they can actually take a recess from the meeting and they can, postpone it
Mhm.
and come back within 10 days.
Great
And so I think
advice.
it's important to know that you have that right, and that's okay. It's okay
Yes.
to say, you know what? Let me think about that, and that's okay. Um, but making sure you know what you're agreeing to, because you don't
Mhm.
want to sign something if you don't fully understand it. And like you said, ask a lot of questions. I think also talking about if there are times where there might be some disagreement, or may get a little tension in there. I think that having that learning mindset that we were talking about of asking questions, can you explain this a little bit more? Can you tell me what this might look like? Or can you show me the data to support that? I think if parents have some of those almost key phrases, like maybe that's something you and I need to work on, is like, what are
Mhm.
the top 10 key phrases that
Yeah.
parents kind of need to just like have up here, so that in those moments, because sometimes when our emotions are high or we're confused or unsure or whatever, we can't think as clearly, right? That shuts down some of our executive functioning, goes a little bit lower when those emotions are high, right? And so if we have maybe just kind of our cheat sheet, so to say, of, can you tell me more about this? What's the
Mhm.
data for that? Or why are you recommending this? Like just have some of those key
Yes.
starter phrases. I think that would be a great tool for parents to have going into those
Mhm.
meetings, just so that they know, okay, I can take a deep breath. I can ask these
Mhm.
questions that can help me give me time to process it and think through it. So,
Mhm, mhm. What do you think about, and this came up on my radar, it actually pops up a lot, where, one of the things that is almost triggering to some parents, some can just roll with it, but some it really bothers, and so, I keep it right here when I'm talking to a parent, are educational acronyms, and how some
yeah,
are just, I think as a, practitioners and educators sitting at the table, it is a second language for
it
what
is.
we would consider, people that have gone through the process and understand, and work on this school, on the campus.
Right.
But then you have a parent that comes in and that is not their
Yeah.
speak.
Yeah.
It for some parents, I will say some are offended, number one, some are overwhelmed, some are triggered, and
Yeah.
some just kind of just sit back and check out. Um, how do you well, first of all, do you talk to your students about that as you're training
Oh,
them?
absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. All the
very
time.
good.
When I used to teach intro to school psych, so this is graduate students, specialist level, master's or doctoral level, first kind of big class, right? So we're given that broad overview of
Yeah.
school psychology practice. I did that where I had, I think it was a quiz or a test, just for fun, all the acronyms I could think of, which is a ton when it comes to all the psychological terms, all the educational terms, and how we talk like that all the time. Even my husband,
Mhm.
we've been married for 16 years. Sometimes I'll say things, he'll be like, "You're gonna have to interpret that. Like, you're gonna have to spell it out," because I say it with the acronyms that I'm so used to speaking about that other parents don't understand or don't use, right?
Yeah,
And so I
right.
think that's really important. That kind of leads into that feeling of parents maybe agreeing to something they don't fully understand
There you go.
because the
Yeah,
school is using so many acronyms or different,
right,
terminology that maybe they
right.
don't understand, people who haven't worked in the schools or have
Right,
that training.
right. Some parents are, I have told me, I'll ask them, what does that mean? What does that mean? And then the meetings are so long and can be overwhelming that they'll just kind of raise, like, I'm just kind of done. So
Yeah.
I do have a list of acronyms that I try
Good.
to share with parents. If that's something that is a challenge for them. But I think as those that are staff, I do want to
Right.
put out a call. If there are any teachers or, practitioners listening, just to be mindful of that and
Yeah.
understand that this is truly a second language for, parents that are trying to understand so many things. And we don't want that to be the one thing that just, that they
Right.
just check out on and say, I don't know. Because it is hard to just stop a group of 10 people, every 2 or 3 sentences, say, "What does that mean? What does that mean?"
Right.
People just kinda
Exactly.
are over it. So, yeah, just keeping that, top of mind, I guess, would be something that comes to mind to me. Speaking of executive function, I heard you mention that a moment
Mhm.
ago, and, I've always learned that executive function challenges are comorbid with ADHD. I was wanting you to talk about that connection and that
Mhm.
impact,
Mhm.
that it has on learning and, how So, how would we address that in the IEP? I know that there's lots of different angles depending on, what type of executive function is
Right.
really, impacting the student and how it impacts their disability. I know that there's
Right.
some tests that will show up on, in the evaluation process. So that's kind of like three things. So if you
Right.
could maybe jump in somewhere there and just
Sure.
let us know
I'll
your thoughts.
Yeah, I'll start at the evaluation since you mentioned that, because in my mind, that's where things start, right? I mean,
That's
we
where it
see
starts.
it, we
Right.
see it in the home, we see it, but until we know, like, we have that diagnosis or we have that testing done. So, like you said, there's several measures that we can use if I was testing your child, to find out where those deficits are. I like to do when I'm looking at executive functioning deficits, I like to do both like parent report ratings because they see different things in the home setting, but also direct testing of executive functioning to see how the child scores on standardized measures. And so you kind of take both of those pieces of information, put that together, and a good report and a good neuropsych report would include those executive functioning strengths and deficits. And then from there, you can build potential goals. So that's kind of more that clinical neuropsych side. And then we take that to educational eligibility. And so how that manifests. So let's say the child has an OHI eligibility and ADHD falls under that. That's another point of I think understanding is that ADHD isn't a standalone educational eligibility.
Yep.
It's a clinical diagnosis, right? But it's not an educational eligibility. There's actually something called OHI, other health impairment. And so that's where ADHD would fall. But a lot of other things could fall under that as well. It's a pretty broad category, but most often we see ADHD fall under the other health impairment educational eligibility. So OHI is one of your acronyms to learn if you're looking at ADHD and executive functioning. But what I would do is you start with assessment. If you got a good assessment, which you should have good, if you get a
Mhm.
clinical neuropsych evaluation, or if you get a good educational eligibility assessment, you should be able to see some of those EF deficits come up as part of the assessment, which should then translate into good intervention goals. And so it should always be based on assessment. We're not just throwing a dart at the wall. Yeah, let's work on this. No, we really need to have that based in some type of standardized as
Mhm.
well as qualitative measures. And so we have that, we have the data, we build a goal based on that, and then we intervene. But what does that look like? Obviously, every kid is individual and it can look very different, but some of our more higher likelihood, how we're going to see that manifested, disorganization. These are the kids whose lockers you open up and it just like falls all out over you.
Right, right.
I think of my own son bringing his huge binder, which he can't even zip anymore because it had so many papers and everything stuffed in there. Just somebody sitting down with him and trying to
Yeah,
go
yeah.
through it and organize it. You're going to see that disorganizational piece. They can never find their homework, right? They don't know where it is. Oh, I turned it in. I promise I did. And it probably never made it there. So those that you're going to see disorganization, problem solving often is a issue with executive functioning. They see the problem and maybe they have an emotional reaction to it, some of that dysregulation component, but they may not be able to stop, think through, okay, I need to do this and then this and then this, and then I can solve this problem. But just having that sequential thought of being able to work through that to get to the
Mhm.
solution, oftentimes that problem solving piece is really difficult. Um, we see it manifest in social interactions too. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes this is a piece people don't often think of. They think of EF as more that cognitive or academic impairment, but it does impact socially. I mean, if you have the impulsivity, it's going to impact a teacher yelling out in
Yep.
class, but it's also going to impact your friends on the playground, right? Because you're going to grab
Mhm.
the ball or you're going to throw it without thinking about what it could do when it hits your friend in the head, or you're
Mhm.
going to push them out of the way because you want to get on the slide first, or whatever it is. It's going to impact you
Mhm.
socially. And so I think that's another area that people often don't think of are the social impacts of executive functioning deficits.
That's true.
Um,
That's true.
testing, I mean, a lot of our
Mhm.
schools do depending on the school, memorization, things that are bigger projects, they really have a hard time breaking those down into smaller tasks and being able to do that. And if it's 3 weeks away, well, they're not going to work on it till the night before, right? Because with ADHD, with EF, you have to have that urgency in order to trigger that frontal lobe and get that dopamine high, so
Mhm.
that then you can get it done. But that's also stressing the poor parents out who have been trying to work on it for 3 weeks so that we don't wait till the last minute, but the
Mhm.
kid waits till the last minute because that's what increases their
Mhm.
dopamine because they get that, oh, I got to
Right.
do it. They get that
Yeah.
urgency. They have to do
Yeah.
it. And so being able to see that and understand that, and then hopefully teach the child as they grow and mature that
Mhm.
they're able to break it down into chunks and be able to do a bigger project. So those are definitely EF deficits that you're going to see manifest in school,
That's
socially,
good stuff.
academically, cognitively. Unfortunately, EF affects everything. I mean, I just finished teaching last week neuropsych assessment course for the year, and it comes up all the time. Executive function. You know, we talk about memory, working memory. Um, visual space. We talk about all the neurocognitive components. EF keeps coming up, even when we're not talking about it per se, and I'm not teaching it because EF affects everything else.
Yeah.
And so it really is a big deal. We had a interesting discussion recently about the interaction between IQ and EF, because
Mhm.
I think we often think of IQ as like, this if you're smart, you're smart, right? But we also know a lot of people who are really smart but can't hold down a job. They can't get to
True.
work on time. They can't manage their tasks or whatever. That's EF. So
Yeah.
even if have 140 IQ and you're super intelligent, if you don't have the
Mhm.
EF skills to be able to implement that
Mhm.
IQ and be able to manage your task or get to work on time or dress appropriately or keep your mouth closed when you need to,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
impulsivity and inhibition,
Mhm.
then
Mhm.
you may not be successful in life, even though you're super
Mhm.
smart and you've got a very high IQ. And so EF is a significant moderator to IQ, and I think that's something also
Okay.
that people don't think about, is how EF impacts all of these other neurocognitive components.
Yeah,
So
that's
even
really
another
good.
example, processing speed is another one. I'm doing
Yes.
a dissertation with a student who's looking at processing speed, and we're trying to just measure processing speed. Well, that's very difficult to measure. You can do just a quick speeded task, but anything outside of that basic speeded task
Mm.
uses EF. And
Mm.
so are we truly measuring processing speed or are we really measuring EF? Well, really, we're measuring EF because
Interesting.
that moderates. It's a moderating variable for processing speed. So it's hard to talk about any neurocognitive component without thinking of EF. And so I really am a big proponent that despite there may be other deficits going on, if we don't focus on that EF and start
Mm.
training kids who have
Mhm.
challenges in this area, it really impacts them as an adult.
I love how you talked about, we see that in testing. And so I really want to remind parents to connect what you said about that to looking at the goals when they're sent out as a draft before you're
Yes.
in agreement. Look and see if just like you said, Wendy, if we have a student that is late turning their papers in and
Mhm.
maybe starts papers and doesn't finish them. So task completion, there's so many little nuances in there that
Mhm.
impact the educational access. And so, what I start to see when I look at drafts is that there's a very little, if any, at times, goals and or well some accommodations but mainly
Yeah.
goals that don't support growth in ef. And so one of the ways we've kind of done a little tricky situation, I'll say, is that if a school is not in an agreement to a goal, we have been able to kind of drive that back to accommodation. So, if an accommodation can fit, then that's great too. So a lot of schools lately too have been very willing to even have it stated on the accommodations that the student will have weekly check-in with case manager
Mhm.
for a student-initiated grade check and student-initiated action plan. And
Mhm.
so, and that could look like deciding if they're going to go to a tutorial, a reteach, a retest, or complete missing work. So they are deciding which of those four things, as an example, that they're going to do, and they're going to write it on paper
Right.
for their plan. And so I've kind of gotten off of the like just driving home. We need a goal. We need a goal. We need a goal. Sometimes it's just we need 5 minutes with our case manager to oversee that and know that we're
Mhm.
having that accountability.
Right.
So that has worked for several students, and actually a school district suggested it in a meeting instead of doing a goal. Let's do some accommodations, and I was a little bit leery at first because there's so many accommodations to begin with. But then the way we wrote it, it just really kind of encompassed everybody as a team and
Mhm.
supported the student. And we've seen a lot of success with that. So, and then basically we're going back, like Wendy was saying, it's going to be in that evaluation. It's going to show
Mhm.
up in your child's evaluation somewhere. Find it, bring it to the meeting and say,
Right.
this is what we're seeing. This is impacting the educational process. Let's put in an accommodation or let's put in a goal if you really want the goal. But
Right.
anyway, that it's just it all it connects.
Mm,
And so, but
right.
just making sure the IEP touches it and brings it in there to support the student. So I just wanted
Definitely.
to add that in because that seems to be working in a lot of
Yeah, and if I can I mean, you might have heard it called check in, check out,
Yes,
CICO, that's what people call
yes,
it, yeah, and so and the part I like about that, not only what you said as far as, like, giving them the choices, you put some of that autonomy back onto the child,
yes,
but it
yes,
also builds a relationship. Oftentimes, it's that one teacher that they check in with, and they build that relationship with that teacher over time, and so that also helps with they want to do it
yes,
for this teacher because they're building that relationship. It's not
yes.
a discipline thing, you're not in
No,
trouble,
no.
and so I think it really helps if it's done in the right way. I think it can be that check in, check out
Yeah.
procedure can be really
I love
helpful
that, and there's been a
for
lot of
kids.
research done on that too,
Yeah,
and I'm
oh yeah,
sure you can
tons.
probably do a whole symposium on that. But that's actually there's a lot of neat things that we can learn about that check in, check out, and I think it's underused with
Mhm,
a lot of students needing that support in that way. So I would challenge parents to check that out even
mhm,
more
mhm,
to find out what that's all about, and that might be something you want to bring up for discussion and collaboration to your next start.
mhm, mhm,
Speaking of ADHD, I know we're really focusing, a lot on that and how that looks at home and how that looks at school. There are a lot of parents that understand what masking means, and I know I'm kind of just going to throw this one out there, but
mhm.
sometimes students, as you know, and you can speak to, can really hold it together, kind of like a big beach ball underwater, and they get home and it
Oh,
all just kind
definitely.
of comes
Yep.
apart. What, strategies have you found personally helpful to
Mhm.
support a child that has struggles with
Right.
ADHD at home, and you see a whole different child, and you're talking about
Yeah.
this in the art, and the teacher's
Yeah.
like, "We don't see that." And I think
Yeah.
that almost just sends parents sometimes like, "But I need
Oh,
you to know
absolutely.
that this is happening," and they're like, "We don't see this."
Yeah, right,
What
right.
can you do, and what do you see? How do you navigate
Right. No, that's a great question. And I could say I've lived that one too. And it's frustrating
that?
because, or I'll say I'm currently living it, literally gets off the bus, throws a backpack down, and we're gone.
Right?
We're not, yeah, we're not there. And so when I talk to his teachers at school, it's not, they're like, yeah, we don't see that. But he did literally flat affect, holds it all in, like physically, I can see it because I know my kid, that I can see his whole demeanor is different at school. We literally get in the car or get off the bus, it's totally that's called after school restraint collapse. And I think our kids with those EF deficits, what we're talking about, they usually have a more extreme after school collapse because it is. They are literally holding it together. They're trying really hard. And it takes so much effort to hold it all together, to keep their words in, to not, punch the kid next to them or whatever it is. And so when they get home, it is just like all out emotional dysregulation. So I think this is one of those things you have to know your kid and you probably have to try a couple different things. So try something for a little bit. If it doesn't work, try the next thing on your list. But I would come up with a list. For us, it's like trying to do one-on-one connection, which is really hard if you have multiple kids. But some type of connect, even if it's 15 minutes, tell me about your day. And if I have food ready, that really helps. I'm not always home before they get home. So sometimes I'm getting home at the same time. But if I'm home before, I try to have a snack out on the counter. So food helps. Can walk right in, get the food right away, that one-on-one connection right away, and then physical for us, getting outside, playing basketball, riding bikes, something to get some of that physical angst out.
Great
Um,
idea.
yeah, all of those things have helped. It's not perfect, and we still deal with it multiple days
Mhm.
a week, but
Yeah.
at least I know it now and I know to expect it, and so I try to have some of those things in place.
I love that, and I think just talking about
Yep,
connection, and we want that so bad, and we understand our kids, and we understand them, home is a safe place. That's where you can take the mask off and have the letdown, and it's okay, and it's a growth process, it's a continuum, but then you have the committee who also explains how they see the child,
sure.
and just most recently had a very, just brokenhearted parent who her perception of maybe the school's lens that they see her student is such that they see a child that gives up easily. They may have danced around the word lazy,
Mm,
maybe said the word lazy.
yeah, that's hard.
Uh, not doesn't want to try, isn't interested in school, sleeps in class.
Right.
So they're seeing a child that is just not plugged in. And
Yep.
so what would you that's a big question actually, and it has so many moving parts. But when
Yes.
you have many professionals do understand that, so I'm not speaking broadly here,
Right.
but for maybe the few that don't see it and don't
Right.
understand it, as a parent, not Dr. Johnson as you go in there, because
Right.
they're gonna be talking to Mrs. Johnson, Dr. Johnson,
Right. Right.
mom.
Right.
They're gonna be talking to mom. How would you come to your child's defense, or what could you say to help a
Right.
staff understand how the disability impacts the educational process?
Right.
And my
Yeah.
child's just not being lazy.
Right. Right. I mean, this is probably a combo of both professional and mom, but I would answer that question with, let's try to figure out the why, right? So
Okay,
what we
good.
see, the topography of the behavior, what's on the outside, right, is the quote unquote laziness, or I'll even say unmotivated, like doesn't want to get their stuff done,
Yep,
or it looks
yep,
that way, right? That's what it looks like. That's what we see. Well, that's what the teachers are seeing, right? Well, we as parents need to dig deeper and try to figure out why and try to
mhm,
understand why. So are they overwhelmed with the task? Probably. So they're shutting down because they'd rather shut down and not do it than do it and fail, right? That's a lot worse to fail in front of your peers, especially if we're talking about middle school and up, right? And so you don't
yep,
want to fail. So it's easier to just shut down and not do it, right?
right,
Or
right.
is it, is it escape? Are they trying to get away with something? Are they trying to get something, like gaining peers' attention by being silly and being the class
Mhm,
clown versus
mhm,
actually doing the work or whatever
right,
it is? So I really would push back on the lazy talk or the unmotivated talk, and let's peel that back a little bit. What's
mhm,
the underlying there? Is the
okay.
child capable of doing the work? Like, is this a skill deficit or a performance deficit? Would be one question we could ask.
Ooh, that's good.
Do they have the skill and they're just not doing it? That lack of that performance. Okay, well then the question is, what's hindering that? Is it exhaustion? Is it overwhelmed? Is it
Mhm,
that they don't know how to do that thing or whatever? What is breaking down there, that they're not performing,
mhm,
they're not, they don't have the skill, so we need to teach the
mhm,
skill. That would be the intervention, right?
okay,
Versus performance deficit, is there something blocking them being able to do it? So that's, you're looking at environment, you're looking at internal. And so I think it's important when we get a quote unquote lazy kid, which I agree, I don't like that term because usually it's
mhm,
a EF if something has,
yep,
shut down, there's some reason there. I would
mhm,
start with performance versus skill. Which is it?
mhm,
Because our intervention is different. And if the school staff
yep.
can't answer performance versus skill, then that's the starting point. We got to figure that out. It
I
could,
actually love that you said that, performance versus skill. And I hope that the parents that are listening really take note of that, because this came up as a hot topic in an ARD meeting in our North Texas community just
mhm,
this last week. And the parent was really trying to articulate that. And I think that that brings it down to very understandable
mhm, yep,
terminology. And
right,
I just have this epiphany that I think every parent should have that locked and loaded
yep,
going
yep,
in to be able to actually share that out with a team, that if there needs to be a discussion on which
right.
is it, what do you see?
Right,
So,
right. I think that's a, yeah, like you said, kind of an easy dichotomy to try to different. I always use the example in my classes, like, is it like we were talking about a kid with a reading deficit, like they're just not getting their reading work done. And we ask that question, skill deficit or performance? Well, if it's a skill deficit, well, we need to teach them how to read, right? We're not going to punish the
okay.
kid because they haven't learned how to read yet. Or are they just not performing it? They know how to read, but they're not finishing their reading
Mhm,
comprehension work or whatever it is. Well, then that's a different intervention and that's a different goal, right? And so we
mhm,
need to answer that fundamental question
mhm,
of skill deficit
mhm.
versus performance deficit, because how we respond to it is going to be different.
Mhm. That kind of begs the next question. I really do want to go there because this is another moving part on that big topic.
Mhm,
And I think that you've articulated that so clearly. And that really begs the question. Let's talk about if it really is overwhelm,
mhm.
then I think that's where it gets a little bit sticky, because that's
Yes.
where there could be a little bit of disagreement on
Yes.
how are we going to deal with overwhelm.
Right.
Because in some regards, we don't want that to look punitive,
Yeah.
but we also want to hold our students accountable for expectations. But if we can't identify that it's overwhelmed, then it looks like maybe we need to work on coping skills. It looks like maybe we need to work on some
Right.
other things and allow that student to be able to reset. Can you speak to that a
Right.
little bit on,
Yeah.
like, how can we back out of overwhelm in a classroom?
Right, and that's a great question because sometimes the child's not even able to articulate that. Like, they're
Correct.
and what the it looks like on the outside is, "No, I'm not doing that," or, more oppositional, and so then they're getting in trouble and they're getting disciplined for
Yes.
behavior
Yes.
issues because they're refusing to do it, or, their words or whatever it is, and so that's what it looks like. But if we know that that underlying cause is overwhelm, meaning it's just too much. I mean, I feel that way when kids move from 5th grade to 6th grade, and now they've got 7 classes and they've got to navigate a locker. And I mean, that's a huge step from an EF perspective to
Mhm.
go from, 1 or 2 or 3 classes at 5th grade and one little hallway to like the whole school. And they've got to navigate all this and books and lockers and different expectations for every
Mhm.
class. I mean, that's
Mhm.
huge as far as EF demands. And so, but then we expect them to automatically do it without teaching them how to do it. And so significant transitions like that. But I think it's got to work both ways, both on the individual level and the child's level of overwhelm. And that's probably going to be more in a relationship with a parent, a trusted adult, somewhere where they can
Yeah.
talk through some of that overwhelm,
Yes.
because that's going to go a little deeper than probably what a teacher can do in the classroom.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
think they're going to have to work through that more in a therapeutic parent relationship type
Mhm.
mindset and figure
Mhm.
out where is the overwhelm? Is it the amount of work? Is it the way the teacher just says it, just sets them off?
Mhm.
Or, is
Mhm.
it a kid in the classroom that's just poking him or whatever?
Mhm.
Figure out where that overwhelm is getting triggered and what is that? And then we can talk with the teacher about how we deal with it. I think in the
Mhm.
moment with the teacher, you're probably not going to get to that underlying root because chances are the
Mhm.
child is so overwhelmed, they're not going to be able to articulate it
Mhm.
and know how to do that. So, I think
Mhm.
I would have to try to take that step back, take that
Mhm.
recess, whatever that looks like, and try to get to the root of where's that overwhelm coming
Mhm.
from.
Mhm.
Um, it's probably just too much, like just too
Mhm.
much. So then you kind of got to make that circle smaller. So maybe the 7 classes is just too much.
Mhm.
Okay, well, we're going to choose two that maybe are your best classes, and we're going to knock those out first, and then the other 3 or 4 that are really tough for you, we're going to break it down into smaller pieces. And I'm going to talk to the teacher and see if we can, instead of it being due tomorrow, can we even take 10 points off and let's
Mhm.
have it due on Friday? It's worth it if we
Mhm.
can still, because I'm more worried about the child learning the
Mhm.
skill or the
Right.
knowledge than I am that they have to do it by tomorrow,
Mhm.
right? That's a bigger picture. And so I think
Mhm.
working through and giving some grace when needed, because I've been there as a parent, when we get home after they're exhausted. These are the kids are holding it together all day long. They're exhausted. And then we got to sit down and do 2 hours of homework. Well, that
Mm.
is torturous for the child and for the
Yeah.
parent who's also exhausted and tired and just wants to go outside and play with their kid. Instead, they have to, no, sit down, no, do this, no, we got to do, which just
Mhm.
escalates that sense of
Yeah.
overwhelm. And so they've
Yeah.
actually made it worse when the teacher's like, "Oh, you didn't get it done in school, you got to do it at home for homework." Well, that's just made the situation worse, not better. And so there's been times
Right.
where I've had, as a parent, have had to say, you know what, I understand that this was the expectation, and I do want to hold them accountable. We were not able to do it last night
Mhm.
due to emotional dysregulation, and we had a basketball
Mhm.
game or whatever it is, like
Mhm.
we have to balance family life as well, and I have to
Yeah.
prioritize my relationship with my son, and so we will
Yeah.
get it done, but we will turn it in late this time,
Yeah. That
and I
sounds
think
like
that's
good
okay.
communication, and that
Right,
sounds like, maybe even going back and looking at accommodations and looking at the
right,
supports, and what works one year may need to back off of it the next
yeah,
year because we've grown, or we may need to sometimes come back in and relook and see if there needs to be additional support. So that's why I love, and some parents don't realize this, especially the young parents who are just starting out. You can call an ARD meeting anytime that you feel
yeah,
like something needs to be addressed, or that something, your child is not able to successfully access their education. And so you're always coming back if that's a need. And so
right,
I think sometimes parents just don't really realize that, and they get frustrated thinking, I don't know how to fix this. Sometimes you just have to go back to meeting and see if you can collaborate with the team and come up with some of these things that Wendy's
hmm,
spoken of. Um,
right,
Talking about home and school, and I want to kind of dial it back a little bit to
mhm,
the early grades and parenting and building independence with children who struggle with executive function.
right.
What have you seen that's been effective in trying to build that independence and that responsibility, and just giving them opportunities for growth in those areas? Has there been something that really resonates with your family and your children?
Yes and no. I say that because I think you can come up with a great system, and but the no part is these ADHD kids seek novelty. right? And so whatever system comes in place and works, like I'm talking about like a reinforcement system or some type of motivational system
Mhm.
or token system or point system or whatever, if you use some type of system like that at home, it's only going to work for a little while. And I think you need to know that going into it because they're going to get bored of it and then it's not going to be effective anymore. And you're going to have to come up with a new system. So, I try not to do too many of those token economy type systems just because
Mhm.
often they don't work for too long. If it's like for a
Mhm.
specific thing, like we have
Yep.
this big test in 3 weeks. Okay, let's come up with a system for that big test.
Mhm.
But to just like do it all the time for everything, it just
Mhm.
loses its novelty and then it doesn't work anymore. So if it's for a specific event or something that has to get done or need to work towards, I think then it's appropriate to use it with these kids. But I think you've got to start with schedules and routines, which I mean, I think when we have
Love
little
it.
babies, we all got them on the sleep schedules and the feeding schedules and stuff. You have to continue that even when they quote unquote should be doing something. So I always challenge parents with kids with EF deficits. You can have, research is hit or miss on this, but 2 to 3 years behind as far as their peers, depending on which research you look at. And so I have a 11-year-old. In some ways, he's functioning like an 8 or 9-year-old, right? Because of
Mhm.
these EF deficits, because of the ADHD or the autism or whatever it is, or trauma. Trauma has a lot of overlap with ADHD and autism in regards to EF. And so I think we have to think of it often as what is their EF age versus
Okay.
what is their chronological age. Because I struggle with that because I'm like, you are 13, you should be's, you should be able to do this, or you should be doing this
Mhm.
on your own.
Mhm.
They're taking over their laundry now, but I shouldn't have to remind you, and I shouldn't have to move it
Mhm.
to the dryer. Like you should be able to do this once I've taught you the system, have it in
Mhm.
place. But they don't. They still need those reminders. They still need that EF. And so I think you have to I think for us as parents need to be appropriate in our expectations. There can't be the should be's, even though we want to, and we naturally probably go to that. There can't, especially. I think it also is hard when you have like a firstborn, maybe real responsible, quiet
Mhm.
girl, and then you get your super loud ADHD second child boy, and they're just so completely different. And so what worked for your first kid doesn't work for your second kid. And so
Right.
we have this framework of, hey, I mean, so and so did it. Why aren't you able to do this?
Mhm.
Or whatever. And so I think some of it is on us too of being
Mhm.
able to set the appropriate expectations and then
Mhm.
being able to follow through on it.
Right.
Kids are
Right.
going to pick apart any system that you're not consistent with, so you
Mhm.
have to set up a system that you're okay with.
Mhm.
I think one thing that's really frustrating is like messy rooms or household chores or whatever system that you have at home.
Mhm.
They're just not going to do it very well, probably. And so I think us as parents have to be okay with that. Or oftentimes it ends up being, hey, you go, pick up the toys in your room, or whatever, and then I have
Mhm.
to come along and let's do it together. So
Mhm.
then you've got that relationship connection piece we've been
Yeah.
talking about. You're getting the job done. Yes, you're having to do it with them, but if you do it with them, you're also teaching them. Yeah, this is how we
Mhm.
organize the books in your shelf. This is where we put all the Legos or whatever it is. And
Mhm.
so you're also teaching them how to do it because they're not going to naturally pick up on it. That's not in the wheelhouse. They're not going to organize naturally, right?
Yes, I love that. I one word that resonates with me is routines,
Yep.
and it's important to establish that early on. And if you've missed that window, if you're a parent they're really not into a routine, it's not too late to go back and teach that. It might be a
No.
little harder. It might be feel a little more uphill because that
Right.
hasn't been commonplace, but jump back in and try that routine. And I
Right.
absolutely love what you said about it's okay. Dr. Johnson just gave every parent in America permission to say this worked and now it doesn't. And so I
Right.
think sometimes there's a little parent guilt
Oh
that we
yeah.
tried, it
Absolutely.
just doesn't work anymore. And so then we throw our hands up in the air, and
Right.
that's where I see some parents feeling very overwhelmed. But I mean, you heard it here first. You just said, sometimes it has a shelf life. It's the novelty
Yep.
is going to wear off, and
Absolutely.
I don't think I've really heard a lot spoken about that before. I
Right.
think it's just, get in there and do the thing, but it's okay. You just kind of have to, you're that magician, you're the parent, it's okay to set that down and say, now we're gonna go this direction and not beat
Right.
yourself up because, you are involved and you are trying and you are providing that support. And that's enough. And some days that
Right.
just needs to be enough. And so
Right.
don't beat yourself up. It's like they grow out of an old pair of shoes. it's time for a new pair of shoes. We're gonna move on and try that
For
now.
sure, for sure. I think
So
another
thank you.
full
Uh-huh.
acronym might be I use with my students is kind of a I do, we do, you do model. And so I
Yes, I
do
love
it
that.
first, yeah, where you're
Yep.
kind of watching me pick up the toys and I'm telling you I'm verbal. This is, they're young, 2, 3, 4. You're teaching them how to do it. Now I'm doing this. Now I'm putting this with that. And they're seeing you, they're hearing you, they're watching you, you're
Oh,
modeling that. That's the
yeah.
I do part. We do it. Now let's do it together. Okay, all the red toys go in this bin or whatever it is, right? We're
Yeah.
teaching them, we're telling them, we're showing them. And then a you do, and then giving them that support as they do it. But that's the challenge, I think, is because these kids need so much more
Mhm.
support and so much longer support that it's often exhausting. And I also want to touch on just one other thing as a parent,
Yes.
because I think this is important too, that we often don't, or I don't see it a lot in the literature, because we talk a lot about, kids and what they need, and all that's true and good. But I think what we don't understand is something, and this is my next book I want to write is on I'm going to call it something like executive functioning fatigue, caregiver fatigue, or something along
Mhm.
those lines, because I think that's something that parents often don't understand. I mean, you have one child with ADHD, maybe, and you've got a two-parent household, you can tag team it when you get overwhelmed or whatever, you can balance the other
Mhm.
kids. It's still hard, but there's, you have other supports there. But when you have multiple children, that's a lot on a parent, especially if it's a single parent home or something. Like, you are the EF for that child in a lot
Yes.
of ways. And so if you're taking that on for multiple children, plus just normal life of doctor's appointments and the car oil change and work expectation, I mean,
Mhm.
just normal stuff
Mhm.
that parents often have to carry. Now that's escalated times 10
Mhm.
because you're doing that for all the children too,
Mhm. Mhm.
multiple times. And
Yeah.
even though they're getting older and they should be starting
Mhm.
to get up and get themselves dressed by now, or maybe
Mhm.
setting an alarm and getting up by themselves, things that just naturally as they get older, they should be able to start taking on some of
Mhm.
that monitoring or self-modeling, but they're not able to. They still
Mhm.
need you to remind them
Yep.
to do it. They still wake them up, till get them up, make sure they've got their clothes ready for school. Do they have their home, all the things, right?
Mhm.
And
Yep.
so I think that's something that I don't see a lot in the literature, is the demand on the parents' EF. And so
Mm.
then we see women like myself in their 40s who are actively parenting, who are the EF systems for
Mm.
multiple individuals, plus the system as a family as a whole.
Mhm.
And they don't
Mhm.
understand that now they're showing ADHD type things, even though ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder, right? We should see it before the age of 5. We should see it
Mhm.
all the way up.
Mhm.
I knew with Levi that he was going to be ADHD
Mhm.
from 2, like I
Mhm.
just knew it.
Yeah.
You could see those signs early on, right? That's a neurodevelopmental disorder, right? But we're seeing ladies in their 40s, and most often it's the mom, not always, but who are showing these ADHD signs and symptoms at 40 that didn't have that neurodevelopmental trajectory. Because of why? Why? Because they're carrying the EF load for multiple different family members, multiple kids, aging parents. We have that sandwich generation. You're taking care of aging parents plus the kids with
Mhm.
EF deficits. And so I think that's something that I just don't see a lot of in the literature, of just what that impact is on the family and on the parent unit, on the moms
Mhm.
a lot of
Mhm.
times, of that EF, that caregiver fatigue, because you are
Mhm.
carrying the EF system for so many different
Mm.
individuals.
That is fascinating. And then I think you definitely should write a book on that,
That's
because
kind
I
of
think you're gonna have a million moms that say, "So now what?"
oh, I
I
know.
do resonate with that. What do I do? What do you
I know.
say?
And that's the question that I am asking myself all the time,
Okay.
because I'm living that right now. There's not a good answer. I can take a night off and go have dinner with my girlfriends, and you're feeling great then, but then you walk right back into that
Yeah.
system
Yeah.
and you're still carrying that load. And so
Yeah.
it's hard to have a long-term
Uh,
change without getting a lot of extra support and just
mhm. Mhm.
growing those kids through some of these phases.
Yeah.
But then
Yeah.
also, you don't want to wish this phase away of your
Yeah.
children, right? You want to
Right.
enjoy it and embrace it, and see all the good things too of that ADHD brain. I tell Levi all the time, is like, you're so creative, buddy. Or I never would have thought about it like that. Like, he thinks of things a little outside the box, not the way I
Yeah.
would have thought about it.
Yeah.
And so I try to show him some of the good parts of the ADHD
Mhm.
brain,
Mhm.
as he's now 11, almost 12 this
Mhm.
week, to start understanding. So as he gets into adolescence, he can
Mhm.
start, hopefully, seeing
Mhm.
some of these
Mhm.
challenges, but also the good
Mhm.
parts about that you
Yeah.
can, he's a great leader. He's, can lead a group of
Yeah.
kids.
Yeah.
Even if they're not making good choices, he will lead them there, right? And so he can lead kids. He can, very entrepreneurial, and so I think
Mhm.
there's a lot of strengths too, but often we don't see that because
Mhm.
behaviors, the talking back, the dysregulation is often what we see the most of.
Right,
And so
right.
parents aren't able to see the good parts too of the ADHD
No.
brain.
I want to capture something that you said, and we're going to dial back just a little bit. You were explaining a scenario where sometimes we were describing what an evening looks like, and then we have 2 hours of homework after that. And so my brain just went there, and I want to just come back to that for a moment and say that parents, as you're communicating with that ARD committee, that IEP team, if you're not in Texas, they don't call it ARDS.
Right.
So IEP meeting for my Oklahoma friends, especially there. And you're literally having an evening. You've got two or three, kiddos, and each of them have this huge amount of homework. That is parent input at that meeting. At
Mhm.
that point, we're maybe asking the team to talk about an accommodation that's going to
Mhm.
ramp back
Yes.
maybe and have shortened assignments not listening the state
Yes.
standards, or up to 30%, whatever the team collaborates and agrees upon.
Right.
Maybe it's going to look like a different accommodation. I don't know, but some parents don't realize that they can take what's going on at home and bring it to that meeting and have that
Mhm.
discussion and
Right.
flesh that out a little bit, and really start to look for supports at school that are going to translate to how things are going to go at home. Because
Right.
schools can't, they're not mind readers. Those teachers are not going to know. I mean, they might
Right.
hear from the student, they might not, but it's going to be incumbent upon that parent. Do you have
Right.
any thoughts on that, as far as like some of that you were talking about, describing that evening? I'm thinking, oh my goodness, like a committee would need to know that so that they could get some good accommodations.
I know.
But yeah, I was,
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think the shortened assignments is definitely something that could happen there. Because what are we looking for? We're looking that the child knows the skill, right? Obviously, we
right,
want the child to know the skill, but do they need 20 multiple choice questions or do they
right,
need five
right,
to show that skill? I would
right.
argue probably five could answer that question, right? And so
Mhm,
that's kind of my point when I'm in the army. Like if it and like I said, I've told the teachers before, especially when he was younger, it's like we just can't. Like I support education. I'm here. I want him to learn. We're doing all these other things to support his learning. But there are going to be some nights where it just may not happen. And I apologize for that and we'll take the consequences for that. But just know that my relationship with my son is more important than me getting the 20 questions done tonight. So I think there is, and I wouldn't have said that when they were little. So I can say that now, parenting. My oldest is 13 and he started in speech at 3. So I've been doing IEP meetings
mhm.
since 3. So for 10 years as a parent on the parent side and almost 20 years on the professional side. And so it's just, I feel like now I can, look back and think I pushed him sometimes too much. Like he was done. He was overwhelmed. There was
Mhm,
too much. I pushed him and hindered our relationship because I was like, oh, we have to get this done because that's me. I'm a
mhm,
type A. I'm a do
mhm,
get it done. That's my personality. School was
mhm,
great. I enjoyed school. I got everything done right. He's not that type of learner,
mhm,
and so I've
mhm.
made him try to be my type of learner, right? And so I think there's been times where now I don't know if this is better or not, but as a more seasoned parent, I can say, you know what, we have tried. We got half of it done, and I'm gonna email your teacher and just let them know that we'll take the lower grade, but we did our best, and for right now, we need to go play basketball outside.
I
Like
think
that's
that
more
is so
important.
profound, and just giving yourself permission. What flipped the switch for you? When did you go, my relationship with my son is I'm going to prioritize that, and we'll
Right.
we'll take the lower grade. I just think that's profound. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's like an exact time period. I feel like it was kind of that fourth or fifth grade time period somewhere. So it wasn't initially, early. It was a little bit later, but it was just like the emotional meltdowns, the dysregulation was just getting so much that I was like, okay, what am I doing this? I'm doing this so he can get an A on the paper, but who is he really learning? Because we all
Mm,
know that when those emotions are high, they're not learning. There's no learning happening there. That's cutting down the frontal lobe,
yeah.
it's not functioning at capacity at that time. And so why are we even doing this? Like we need to go take a break. We need to come back to it. Maybe we'll try again in the morning on the way to school. Like if their emotions are high, they're not learning. So you're not getting anything done and you're wrecking your relationship. You're hindering that connection
Yeah.
point because now they're mad at you too.
Yeah.
Instead just
Yeah.
we go take a walk or
It's
we
a
go ride our bikes or
cycle.
something.
We're in a
Yeah. And so
cycle. Yeah. Yeah.
it just makes it worse and worse. And so there have been those conversations and again, I mean, obviously, I support education and I have my PhD and this is what I do, but it's like at some point that's not important. That relationship has to come first. That connection has to come first,
Yeah.
and then, so prioritizing, I wrote down prioritizing relationship over
Yeah.
productivity, because both my husband and I are type A's. We like to get things done. We do it, boom, boom, boom. But our children are
Yeah.
not like that. And
Yeah.
so I
Yeah.
think as a parent, you have to learn to not put your own work ethic or whatever you want to call it onto your
Mhm.
child. They may need to
Right.
do it differently. If that means standing on his head over there, or, laying
Mhm.
off the bed as he's memorizing his
Mhm.
multiplication facts or whatever. You got
Right.
to think of something different, because these kids are not going
Right.
to learn by picking up their paper and by studying the normal way that I learned, right? They're going to
Yeah.
learn it in a different way. So what does
And
that look
coming to that realization, and I would have loved to have known you several years back and seen that piece of your journey, because I think
like,
what you've shared is so profound. And I think that parents have to give themselves permission. There are so many things you've said tonight that are just so, I think, freeing to,
yeah,
if I'm a parent on the other end of this listening, going, I can let go of that. I maybe
right,
can look at that differently. I can zoom out there, because we are so hard on ourselves and we do have such high
right,
expectation. We do push sometimes because we've got to get it done, got to get it done.
yep,
But I love that you are so transparent and sharing. Like, look, this is where we were. This is where we came.
right.
And so, if you were to zoom out at your relationship with your son, you obviously probably that's flourished and grown in a way that maybe it wouldn't have had that opportunity if you hadn't changed. Would you agree?
I mean, I hope so. He's 11 turning 12. I feel like we're entering the the fun teenage
The
adolescence
fun, the
years
fun
here.
times. Yeah, sure.
So I guess I can let you know in about 6 or
We'll
7
circle
years,
back on that.
hopefully. But I
Yeah.
mean, I just try to have those connection points, because there's a lot of, I'll just say ODD, defiance type things. Because again, overwhelmed has been
Mhm.
abiding by the rules all day long. So the last thing you want to do is, hey, bud, go take out the trash. Okay, go do your laundry. Go, like more of the same
Boom,
that he
boom.
just got all
Yeah,
day in school. And
yeah,
so you're trying to balance that between, hey, let's go shoot hoops, or let's go on a walk, or, trying to build that
yeah.
connection. And I think, especially for boys, if you're doing an activity, you can talk to them and connect with them, but
True.
you're not just going to sit and talk like you and I are doing right now. Chances are, right? You got to go do
Activity and
something.
conversation with the
Yes,
boys,
yes.
especially too. And I
What did I
think,
just hear?
yeah,
Motion changes emotion. I like that. So
motion. You said motion.
motion changes emotion.
I'm,
So
I'm
I
gonna write
like
that
that
down.
one. Yeah. I know, right? And I thought that was so true. I mean, I do it, but I never put it in those words. And so it's so true. So it's like, hey, I mean, even literally tonight before this, an hour before we were doing this, I was like, okay, I just got an hour, but we were having a meltdown with my other son, and I was like, you know what? Because he didn't want to finish his dinner, didn't want to take a shower, no, 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 And so I said,
Yeah.
hey, bud, come here, let's talk about this. I said, hey, why don't you go ask dad for a compromise, because we're working on having the right words. Like, I don't want to take a shower right now. I want to go play outside.
Right.
So is there a way that we can ask that in a respectful way, ask for a compromise, and say, hey, dad, can I play for 5 minutes and then go take my shower? And so I talked him through that, sent him back in there. He did it. And then we went and rode scooters for 5 minutes up and down the street. And then he came back in, took a shower, and I came in to
And
do
then we were
this,
done.
And so it's not
Motion
perfect. It
change.
doesn't work every time. But what did he learn from that? One, we didn't have a full out meltdown, because we didn't, no, you have to take a shower right now.
Yeah.
Did we able to compromise? He learned how to ask for it. Now he
Mhm,
not
mhm,
quite there where he can do it on his own, but with prompting and support, with
mhm,
scaffolding, he was able to go back and talk to dad
mhm,
and say, okay, dad, can I have a compromise?
mhm,
Yes, what's your
mhm,
compromise? Can I have 5 minutes to go play
mhm,
outside? Yes, you can do that.
mhm,
And then we'll go take a shower. Okay, boom. Then we move
mhm.
past it. So
Yeah,
I think there's
I
just
love
ways
that.
of figuring out how to navigate these kids, because often if you hold that hard line,
Yeah,
it's just
yeah.
going to lead to more dysregulation instead of trying to
Absolutely.
bring
And
them
I
back to
see
balance.
that a lot of times at school where that's kind of that line
Oh,
is
yeah,
drawn and then it's the student and the teacher just going head to head. I
absolutely.
like the accommodation and it would need to be discussed and kind of fleshed out, but that in a classroom could look like offer controlled choices. That's a
Yeah,
great accommodation, especially for the younger kiddos who are
yep,
really wanting their way, and there's nothing else that's going to keep them from getting their way, and
right,
that's just where they're at right then. And we're going to try to mold that and grow that and shape that and help that, support that. But sometimes that looks like teacher controlled choices, but then making the student feel like they have say. But I
Yes.
also like what you said about compromise, like learning to use your words to talk
Right.
about compromise and what that looks like. I think that's an early
Mhm.
childhood skill that needs to be taught from the get-go, that
Right.
needs to be practiced. It's something over time and that's going to grow. But those can also be reflected in an IEP and in the accommodation. So I
Right.
love
Right.
that. And if a parent is working on those things, like Wendy mentioned, like at home, but it's still not really happening at school, maybe that's where that conversation can start with a
Mhm.
team to try to come up with some ways to help that at school, because that could look like total shutdown
Oh,
and
absolutely.
impeding the learning if that's going to happen in
Mhm.
school. So
Right, and I
I,
think that,
uh-huh.
like, that
Yeah.
5-minute break I just talked about, I think that at school, that can be that choice card or, "Hey, can you go take this note to the teacher next
Yes.
door?" Or whatever. I mean,
Yes.
there's so
Get
many
them
things you can
moving.
do, yeah, to
Mhm.
give that kid that 5-minute break, go get some water, go to the
Yeah.
office, it doesn't even have to be there's just something about getting up, moving, doing something, getting unstuck because we call it brick brain, right? They kinda get stuck and whatever that is, and that's gonna look
Mhm.
like shutting down or not doing it or lazy, right? And
Yeah.
so just
Yeah.
trying to break that cycle, they're stuck in there and do something different.
Right. Right.
I think is a and I
Mhm.
do feel like teachers
Mhm.
often struggle with that because it's like,
Yeah.
no, I asked you to do this. This is what you need to do. Everyone else is
Mhm.
doing it.
Yeah.
And these
Yeah.
kids, it just doesn't work that way.
I
And
have a
so,
parent recently say that this teachers or the related service personnel were asking her, how do you get, and this is a very young child, how do you get your child to perform or give you what you're asking for, and they're
mhm,
asking the parents, like, tell me your secrets because we're struggling at
yeah,
school.
yeah,
And so a lot of what you shared that's working at home, a lot of times parents do have things that are really working. Share it out with the team and let them know, these things are working, and they can take that and look through an educational lens and kind of shape that and mold that and put that in the
right,
IEP. But they want to get to know your child and how best to work
mhm,
with them. So I love that you offer. You have so many great ideas that are already working so well at home, that I'm sure you've brought to the table before when you've talked to the teachers.
we
Um,
try to, yeah, it doesn't
yeah.
always translate exactly, but there are some things that you can do the same concept, in the
Yeah.
educational setting. It's challenging, especially now that we've hit middle school because they have so many
Yeah.
teachers and they're changing classes. And so I think some of this can be more doable in an educational, elementary educational type setting, just
Yeah.
because they're mainly with maybe one teacher in that
Right.
classroom. And so you can do a lot of these things that you
Yeah.
may not be able to do when they get middle school and high school level.
That's true, and they do try to ramp back and not have so many accommodations and,
Yeah.
like, strive for that independence and that responsibility, and
Mhm.
it looks like kind of, shedding a lot of that, and we do want that. At the end of the day, we don't wanna saddle our children with too many accommodations that are not needed. We really wanna look, carefully at that, but you gave a lot of great ideas that, are going on at home, that some of them can translate, maybe some of them not, but it's good conversation
Right.
either way. Just to kind of tie everything together, Wendy, I was going to ask, are there any resources or tools or books, whether you've written them or someone else has written them? We know you have a lot of great resources that I know you share out not only with your students at the university,
Yeah.
but what would you recommend to parents navigating the art process or navigating neurodiversity in their home,
Right.
to maybe just give them a little extra? What would you suggest?
Right, right. I think on that in the home setting, I think it's figuring out that you're not alone. I think
Mhm,
parents need to
mhm.
hear that. I think they need to hear you're doing a good job, even if it's your kid who's having the meltdown in the Walmart parking lot, right? Parents
Yeah,
need to hear that even when it doesn't feel that way, because it doesn't feel that way. It feels like you're failing because your kid's having the meltdowns and dysregulated and getting in trouble at school or whatever it is, and just feel like you're failing, right? Because so much of our social media driven society is the perfect little family pictures, right? Especially, I feel that way as a psychologist mom because I'm like, oh, they all know I'm a psychologist. My kids really need to be well behaved. No, I mean, it's even worse because it's like, no, my kids are the ones having the meltdowns, right? And fighting out in the parking lot or whatever it is. So it's just like being okay with that. I'm not always okay with it, but I think I'm getting better at it because it's just like, you know what? I know we're trying. We have supports in place. So I think having those clear expectations, one with yourself, you got to start with yourself as a parent. Like, what are my expectations for my child? Is it
Yeah.
appropriate? A skill deficit, performance deficit? And then when you're looking at that school interaction, that collaboration with the school, is what are your expectations for your child educationally? I think we've touched on a lot of home and school stuff, but I think, some are the same, some are different. But as far as going into that IEP meeting and knowing that, what do I think is appropriate for my child? I think I want to always tell parents to ask for the IEP in advance. They're supposed to give it to you, to give time to review it. Doesn't always happen, but you need to
Right.
ask for that. You need time to look at the goals, really think through it. Are there certain goals that you feel like are great, ones that maybe aren't the best fit? And I think going into that meeting with that framework of knowing, hey, we have 3 goals. 2 of them I think are okay. Let's talk about these. This one, I'm not sure about this one. Let's talk about it. And just knowing that going into it, I think really does help. Knowing your rights. I think making your asks reasonable as a
Mhm.
parent going
Mhm.
into an IEP meeting. I think there's certain things that we as parents, definitely need to stand up for and advocate for. But I think there's also other things, and this I'm going back to my time when I was a school psych in the school districts, is that sometimes I feel like parents would come in and be like, do you even really know what you're asking for? And not in a
Mhm.
demeaning way, but just meaning
Mhm.
like, this isn't, schools don't do this, or like it's just
Mhm.
not an appropriate ask for that setting. We're a very high functioning child who is doing great, and they want a
Yeah.
one-on-one aid all day long,
Oh,
every,
goodness. Right.
like just things like that, that where the ask doesn't match up with the need. So
The
I think
need.
it's important to kind of say, okay, where's my child really struggling? What do I think as a parent will help them? And then let's hear what they have to think that's going to help my child, and then is there something we can do to kind of blend those two
Mhm.
expectations together, and just
Mhm.
really being clear on what that looks like, and having that mind of compromise and collaboration, but also
Mhm.
knowing your rights. And there is a time, I think parents need to know there is a time to stand up and say no, or I don't think so, or that's not the best fit. And that's okay too. And I don't
Mhm.
think parents often feel validated in that they have a
Mhm.
say. I mean, you're an equal voting member in that IEP meeting.
Mhm.
You sign on the line, and it's okay to disagree too. It's
Yep.
okay to check disagree on there, and it's okay to take that recess or come back, or ask a supervisor to be there. I've done that many
Yep.
times,
Yep.
where you just ask the special ed supervisor, may we take a recess, and could we have the special ed supervisor attend the next meeting so we can talk
Mhm.
about this more? Great.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think having staffings too. Sometimes you need to have a meeting with somebody outside of the ARD meeting because you can be
Mhm.
more honest. You can talk through things. You can come up with a compromise. So then when you go back
Mhm.
into that official legal meeting, you're more on the same page,
Mhm.
and that's okay too, is to have a staffing outside of the
Mhm.
ARD.
Mhm. I love it. I love it. Those are all excellent suggestions, just very, very important as you walk through the art process. And I always tell the parents, I know you're always going to be at the table for as long as you're at the table, but as far as you're able, just be prepared. If you get there and you don't feel prepared, it's okay. Give yourself grace. Ask a lot of questions, take some notes. And I love that you said it all through the evening. If you need a break, take a break. We tell our kids
Like,
that all the time. We encourage that.
I know.
And sometimes we do. And I've been in a lot of our meetings where we'll ask for a 5 minute or a 10-minute break, go get a drink of
Mhm.
water,
Right.
just take it to breathe, and try to just be positive and collaborative, as much as we're able. And I think you said the word
Mhm.
reasonable too. Be sure and make reasonable requests. I
Right.
think that if you ever had to go to due process or mediation or anything
Right.
above and beyond just a regular IEP, I think I've heard friends of mine that have been in training with the lawyers through the school district have said, the main thing is, the judges will look at, reasonability, just making sure
Mhm.
that those requests on both sides are
Right.
reasonable. I think that's just a big key word there, to
Right.
make sure that it matches the need. And I think you dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's.
Mhm. Mhm.
I just can't thank you enough for the time that you've spent with us tonight and answering
Sure.
all of the questions, and then just weaving in just Wendy as mom. You were
Mhm.
just very real about saying, hey, this is what it looks like some days. And
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with that because that's just life. And we're, growing through the process. So I appreciate your
Mhm.
transparency, your professionalism, and just sharing those tips that you bring to the meeting, just as mom. And then also too, just so much respect for what you do on the university level and training up the next generation of professionals who are going to work with our precious children. And that's a big ask and a big responsibility. And I know you do that well.
Yeah, well,
Um,
thank you. No, it's been
yeah.
fun. It's fun to
Where
talk about
can
these
we
things.
find you down the road? Are you going to be speaking anywhere, doing
Yeah.
anything
Well,
fun
I can give
in
you
the near
my
future?
email. Yeah, my work email address, Wendi Johnson 4, the number 4 at tw.edu. So anyone's welcome to email me. That's fine. We actually just had, I think I said this to you, that a book came out yesterday. I was I was an editor on, so there's lots of different perspectives in that book, but it's understanding and managing neurodevelopmental disorders in kids. And so it's really good because it talks about so many different, medical, psychological, different things that are impacted. So I think that would be a great resource. It's a nice one, but you can get a paperback for not too much, or a digital copy as well. It just launched on Amazon yesterday. So
Awesome.
yeah,
Congratulations. I just learned
thanks.
something new
Yeah,
about you all the time. Well, we want to stay in touch and maybe we'll have you circle back and come back and
sure.
share a little more down the road. But thank you so much for your time, Dr. Wendi
Uh,
Johnson.
no
We
problem.
appreciate you.
Anytime.
All right.